Bastian. Chapter 91, Last Chance. The rising sun's warm light flooded the room, painting every corner with its radiant hues, and even the tightly closed curtains couldn't dampen the cheerfulness of this bright morning. Bastian straightened himself, shifting his weight away from the wing chair's backrest. He opened a cigarette box without taking his gaze off Odette, seated at the opposite end of the sofa. He would have admired her in the angelic glow of the sunlight cast upon her, if he had not found out that she had betrayed him last night. Only when he took a cigarette from the box did Odette lift her head to look at him. She was deathly pale, emphasized by the redness of her eyes. Bastian said nothing and just looked at her as he lit his cigarette. All Odette could do was endure his scrutinizing gaze, enduring the punishment that stretched on needlessly. Though she was filled with sorrow, Odette refused to let herself shed a single tear. Begging for mercy or forgiveness was futile, so she didn't waste the breath. All she wanted now was a temporary respite, to delay judgment until Bastian's business with the Emperor was concluded. After that, she would accept any fate, so long as she could maintain her protection of Terra. "Please," she pleaded silently. Just as her gaze began to waver, Bastian flicked the ash from his cigarette into the ashtray, adding to the ever-growing mound. "If only you hadn't gotten caught." Bastian exhaled a cloud of smoke, which hung in the air above their heads. He did not raise his voice, but the anger was still clear. "How long were you planning on deceiving me, Odette felt like this might be her last chance, but she struggled to find the words. No lie would last long under his scrutiny, so honesty seemed to be the only option left to her. After all, Bastian Clauswitz was a practical man. The Emperor's deal held them firmly in marriage. "I thought I could hide it until you went to war," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Our contract ends when you return, so I thought if I could just get through that, I could safely request a divorce." "Ah, divorce." Bastian remained taciturn, until a slow smile crept along his face. She might have been good at acting like a good wife in the open, but secretly she was a spy bent on betraying him. Bastian nodded approvingly, acknowledging Odette's plan. All he had to do was free himself from any vain and foolish notions to see the woman for what she truly was, a cold, calculating snob. Despite the blue blood running through her veins, she was mean and vulgar. He had let himself be blinded by her beauty and charm, but at the end of it all, she was no different to his stepmother. As he looked back on their time together, his true nature was clear for anyone with an ounce of wit to see. Wandering from one low point to another, seeking a marriage that would elevate her far above what she deserved. She was able to disguise her greed quite well. What really niggled at him was that she didn't even have to try. He was so enraptured by the fantasy of it, that he willingly let himself get deceived. Discarding the cigarette butt, Bastian rose from the seat. He took a step toward the train window and yanked the curtains open, making himself temporarily blind by the bright sun. "I love you, let's go together." Bastian's lips curled into a sneer as he recalled that futile confession of love. He couldn't help but feel a slight appreciation for his stepmother exposing the lie for what it was. At the very least, it stopped him making a critical error, though he had already made a fool of himself. He loosened his bow tie. It felt like it was slowly choking him. His watch said 8 in the morning, the moment had arrived to commence preparations. Time to embark on his journey to be a hero. Middle. Bastian went through his morning routine robotically. He washed, shaved and changed into fresh attire. His agile movements went through the motions without thought, composing a countenance that betrayed no hint of how tired he was from the sleepless night. He finished by neatly combing his hair and slicking it back with pomade. Odette did not move from the end of the sofa, watching him go through his routine. It felt like she was paralyzed in a nightmare. She longed to plead for her judgment, the waiting felt like a punishment itself. "Prepare yourself, madam," Bastian finally said to her. He adjusted his medals with meticulous attention to detail, then slowly turned to face her. As she looked up at him with mournful eyes, it felt like a veil lifted, revealing the woman who had captivated him since the day they had met. "You said you wanted to atone for your sins, did you not?" His voice was calm. He turned and watched the tranquil waters of Lake Lausanne float past. He still desired that woman. It drove him mad, especially when he played with the idea to strike up the deal with the Emperor and force Odette into marriage. Tie the knot and have her commit to him for the rest of her life. It felt like he was under the influence of a spell. He chuckled as he took measured steps toward her. She had not said a word. Gradually his mind cleared from the pink fuzz with each step. He understood Theodora Clauswitz's intentions in exposing the spy. Theodora had no intention of causing a scandal. She wasn't foolish enough to challenge the emperor directly, however it was clear that she deliberately used Odette as a weapon to provoke him. And he fell right into her trap. Through no fault of his own, he had disrupted a meticulous scheme, and in order to make future promises, he would have to invest a lot of time and money once again. It was clear that the battle to come was going to be a lot more challenging than any he had fought before. All because of you. Once he stood right in front of Odette, he reached down and seized her chin, noting her enduring beauty. Even in that moment, when all he wanted to feel was contempt for the betrayer, he couldn't help but feel his heart lift when she looked into his eyes. "Act modestly, Mrs. Clauswitz," Bastian ordered, but strengthen his grip. Of course he would strike a deal with the emperor. Taking a deep breath, he knew he had to fulfill the marriage agreement he had made to compensate for the damages Odette had caused. He had no choice but to tolerate this woman for as long as it was necessary. Once the festival was over, he would go to Trosa Island, where he could seize lucrative opportunities for a few days' patience, especially if he had to deal with this woman. "I know you don't want to end up in prison, so you need to play along, otherwise you will be exposed as the criminal who attempted to kill her own father." Does that sound like a more compelling reason than adultery? Bastian? It's up to you. Live as the perfect little wife to the end of your contract, or I will put you in prison. You're good at pretending and deceiving everyone, that much is true. Odette groaned as he pulled her chin up. "Enough with your foolishness, Odette, your debts will be brought to count by Tira Brailer," Bastian warned. "No, she has nothing to do with this." For the first time, emotion flickered across Odette's face. Bastian was taken aback, but quickly replaced his surprise with a mocking laugh. "Tira, please, spare her. It's all my fault, please." "Shut up, Odette," Bastian frowned at her. "All you need to do is obey me. It was clearly stated in the contract you signed. Smile as though you were the happiest woman in the world." He traced his gloved thumb around Odette's lips and smiled at her elegantly. "If you wish to safeguard your little sister's life, you must perform admirably. Middle. Bastian. Chapter 92. If I could live that season again. The express train to Lausanne pulled into its final destination, and Franz guided his fiancée off the train. The platform of the central station was teeming with onlookers eager to catch a glimpse of the naval officers. Naturally, Bastian Clauswitz basked in the golden praise. "Make way, step aside," the officers shouted, but despite the concerted effort to clear a path, the onlookers remained stalwart and the passengers of the train had to push their way through. "He's just an officer, not the damnable prince," Ella grumbled, unable to tear her gaze away from the entrance. Franz waited for Bastian with a relaxed smile ever present. He was genuinely looking forward to greeting him. He relished at the idea of witnessing Bastian's pride firsthand. While he was concerned for Odette's safety, Franz recognized the need to sacrifice to free her from a life no better than prison. Revealing Bastian's true nature to the world, it would significantly ease the divorce proceedings. "Oh look, there, he's getting off now." The onlookers buzzed with excitement, catching sight of Bastian. Franz swallowed nervously and tried to crane his neck over the crowd. Captain Clauswitz appeared with his beautiful wife. They beamed at the crowd with the biggest smiles and greeted the onlookers with such enthusiasm. When Bastian removed his cap and offered a bow, the cheers erupted and reached a fever pitch. Odette looked up at her husband with such affection and pride. "Please, look over here," reporters were shouting, brandishing their cameras like weapons. Bastian obliged and turned to the press, posing for them. His smile was charming, and the way he embraced his wife displayed his ostentatious possessiveness. Franz looked at his mother, confused. Even Theodora could hide her sense of unease as the couple leaned into one another for a kiss. How could this be? Had he chosen not to blame Odette for betraying him? Franz forced down a lump in his throat. The flash of the cameras dropped in his mind. In that brilliant flash of light, Odette smiled, embodying the image of the perfect wife, and they lived happily ever after. Middle. Prince Nikolai decided to take decisive action, ending the lingering doubt that had been plaguing him for months. With a sigh of despair, he made sure there was no more doubt. "Princess Isabel's side is also clean. Her entourage informs me that her heart is set and she is sticking to her bridal class," the attendant said. Prince Nikolai nodded approvingly as he watched the Belov delegation progress along the main road leading to the naval port, where the emperor's envoy was waiting. The streets were adorned with the naval flags of both nations, fluttering in the breeze. Pollen floated on the air, like tiny golden drops blessing the progression. The military band played their marching tunes and the crowds cheered. The parade had surpassed all expectations, becoming a grand spectacle. Emperor Berg's intentions were clear, as he positioned Belov's name right next to the commemorations of the country's victory. It was a clear ploy to forge a military alliance between the two nations, perhaps also serving as an apology for his daughter's misstep. Prince Nikolai smiled at the piece of paper in his hand. They were a summary of Captain Clauswitz's and his wife's history, from their initial encounter to their eventual marriage. What a mess, suspecting his wife's infidelity and meddling in other people's affairs. It may be embarrassing, but it was necessary in preparations for a national marriage. The Berg imperial family had done their best to cover up the scandal surrounding the wayward princess, but there were still many aspects that were unclear. Isabel claimed her love for Bastian was something that had been nurtured from childhood. Even before the national marriage. She couldn't suppress her feeling and neither could she escape them. Isabel's passion for Bastian surpassed all boundaries of mere infatuation. All he could do was muse on the thought that being blinded by love ran in the Berg family. What made it worse was the indifference Bastian showed Isabel. It pained Nikolai to witness the cold treatment from the grandson of a junk dealer, but Isabel's heart remained unrequited. It also made the marriage to the daughter of a fallen noble very suspicious. He had his thoughts, backed up when he met Bastian's wife, Odette, when they were introduced at a promotion ceremony. Nikolai had seen unequaled beauty before, but when he laid eyes on Odette, his breath escaped his body. He could not avert his gaze, no matter how hard he tried. If only she had been the emperor's daughter, he could have secured a marriage with her in a heartbeat, but she was given away like a bounty. The one-line title, "The Man Who Married at First Sight Still Passionately Loves His Wife," captured a wife beaming with happiness and a husband gazing lovingly at her. Attached to the report's last page was a photo of the couple from the evening paper, provoking an upsurge of resentment in his chest. It reminded him of the promotion ceremony all over again. "I want this report discarded," Prince Nikolai said, handing over the useless document to his attendant. Despite Isabel's past, though a source of shame, was not an issue capable of severing the marriage between nations. Nikolai firmly believed that. Despite her immaturity, Isabel held no lingering attachments to her cousin's husband. With the matter resolved, the wedding would proceed as planned. Prince Nikolai stepped out of the car, feeling a little lighter than before. The cheers from the crowd added to the excitement of the festival. The prince made his way to review the vessel escorted by the honor guard. The distinguished guests, who had already arrived, stood as one and applauded, showing courtesy to the ally delegation. Odette could easily be recognized by the stiff, upright manner in which she sat. Prince Nikolai glanced at her. It looked as if her face had gone paler overnight, making her look sickly. He frowned at the sudden change. She looked at him at the moment, with a bewildered expression, which was quickly covered by a warm smile. Her eyes shone just as brightly as they had always done. He greeted Odette before passing by. Bastian Clauswitz's wife was stunningly beautiful today, leaving the only memory etched in his mind. Middle. Bastian finished preparing for the review, buttoning his gloves before leaving the cabin. As he stepped outside, he was momentarily blinded by the bright sunlight. He took in the view: high, blue sky dotted with cotton clouds, the vast sea that connected the horizons, and let the fresh wind blow across his face. The naval review ceremony was the festival's main attraction. Today, the Empire's warships were scheduled to pass by for review in a specific order. Bastian was assigned to the very first battleship, at the head of the review. The honor eclipsed the shame of his past. "Hey there, Bastian." A voice called up to him as he went down the metal stairs. He recognized the voice. It belonged to a senior officer whom he often spoke to when he needed advice. The officer approached with admiration, quickly coming to a halt and waited for him at the bottom of the steps to the bridge. Recognizing the reason, Bastian calmly reassured him, "We can speak freely when no eyes are upon us." But, he hesitated briefly, eye starting to Bastian's major rank badge, before smiled lightly. "All right then, if that's what the major desires, I'll comply." "Thank you, Bastian." "You're welcome. Did the confession go well? Will you be going with your wife?" "I have received my appointment as planned," Bastian said. "Does that mean you will be departing alone?" "Yes, that's the decision I have made," Bastian said, calmly nodding. Their conversation did not progress as a group of officers were approaching them. Showing his courtesy with a shallow bow, Bastian moved on past the new group as they saluted him and he saluted in return. Bastian made his way up to the main deck, where the midday sun felt hotter than it ought to have done. He leaned on the railing, his mind drifting back to when he came out of the Admiralty only to find Odette sat by the fountain, waiting for him. It was from that day that their relationship held more meaning than what was consigned to a contract. If I could live that season again, all these thoughts were nothing more than meaningless assumptions about the past. He knew that dwelling on them was futile and he needed to concentrate on what was to come. He should focus on the present. As he made up his mind, the sound of the captain boarding brought him back to reality. The officers, who had been chatting away noisily, took their seats and Bastian joined them at the head of the vanguard. This was a position he had worked hard for, not something that was given to him out of privilege. He stood at his assigned position facing the Luzon Sea. His mind was clear, devoid of distraction. Despite the losses he had suffered, the gains he obtained along the way made it worthwhile. As the captain boarded, a long whistle pierced the silence, signifying their departure. Bastian looked toward the horizon, lifting his eyes from the shadow of his officer's cap. It was a perfect day, marking their voyage blessed by the god of the sea. Middle. Bastian. Chapter 93, Glory Day. The review got underway as the vanguard set sail. Warships formed a line a short way out from the port, and as each ship passed, they took their position in the long line stretching out along the horizon. On the port, the crowd had gathered in thick swarms to witness the ships passing, their enthusiasm never wavering during the long process. They persisted as near 100 ships took their turn to line up. By the time the final ship took its place, the line stretched as far out as the eye could see. Odette focused her attention on the lead ship, the Vanguard. Memories of the last 2 days melted from her mind like butter. Since returning the stolen documents to Bastian, time seemed warped, leaving her feeling like she was not really alive in her own mind. "Odette, you look stunning today," a friendly voice broke through her increasingly distant consciousness. Startled, Odette turned to face the source of the voice to see the Emperor and Empress approaching her. They must have boarded the ship without her notice. The prince, his wife and Princess Valerie were also with them. "I see you're eager to back with your husband, I'll have to hurry then," the Emperor said, casting a glance out to sea, toward the Vanguard. His light jest elicited a whispered laugh from the Empress. Odette lost her composure slightly, but was quick to gather herself, making it seem like she had lost herself to the excitement. She gave them a warm smile, not too warm, just enough to give the impression of a bashful young wife. As the Emperor and his family took their seats, the excitement that had permeated the deck of the review ship gradually calmed. Odette settled into her seat behind the prince and his wife. Despite the worsening headache, she refused to drop her smile. She was like the happiest woman in the world. All in the name of protecting her sister. "Look over there, Odette, come on." Odette was roused by Marchioness Demel's excited voice. She was pointing to the flagship, the very one Bastian was on. It was saluting, marking the start of the ceremony. The Emperor climbed a podium and the guests rose out of their seats. Odette followed suit, striving to maintain her balance. With the fleets aligned, the soldiers were visible on deck, stood to attention and saluting. After the salute, the band struck up the imperial anthem. The Emperor's review ship slowly drifted past the Vanguard shop, its soldiers becoming a distant smudge of dark shades. The memory of Bastian lingered in Odette's mind though. Major Clauswitz's presence blazed like the midday sun, the brightness of it leaving no respite for her eyes. It only served to remind her of that meeting at the Rheinfeld Hotel lounge. Odette shook her head, eager to move on from those memories. Bastian only saw marriage as a means to an end. She was only his for 2 years, and after that, would she be dumped like yesterday's garbage? They had shared a moment of affection, but it ultimately stemmed from his fleeting desire to bed her. Bastian had not once faltered in his initial decision. The review floated on well into the afternoon. The Emperor proudly displayed his naval might for all to see and delighted with a smile. "Now, how about a round of applause for the hero's wife?" the Emperor said, looking at Odette. Quickly, he orchestrated clapping from all the guests on the boat. Though it was rather unexpected, Odette remained as stalwart as she could manage. Initially with a gracious smile and a nod, she waved as only befitting the wife of a hero. Middle. When the sun set, the festive lights illuminated Lausanne and gave life to the city. Nation flags and colorful lanterns on every street, Sandrine enjoyed the breathtaking view. She leaned on the railing, cigarette smoke lazily drifting from her mouth. "There are rumors that he will take his wife along with him to his new post," she said. "Ah, Yes, I suppose he could do. Did you hear anything else? The noble lady next to Sandrine said. Odette, Odette, Odette. At the shipboard party hosted by the Emperor, the name Odette was heard everywhere. Nothing yet, so I suppose it's all going ahead as planned. It's not like Bastian to reverse a decision at the last minute. Sandrine looked out across the deck. She could see Bastian chatting with the Crown Prince of Belov. You underestimate him. When it comes to love, he has the ability to transform into a completely different person, more erratic and unpredictable. The noble woman observed with a smile. Indeed, Sandrine said, puffing out more smoke. Who would have thought that Bastian, of all people, would become such a beloved figure? It's no surprise if the unexpected were to happen. That's right, in fact, they are a couple where nothing goes as expected. In the midst of the mocking jest, Odette decided to appear, attracting the attention of all the junior officers' wives. Something felt off about her. Sandrine could sense it as she narrowed her eyes at Odette like a sleepy cat. She couldn't help but wonder if Bastian was trying to turn this woman into a true wife. Amidst the cheerful music and ambient notes of laughter, champagne bottles were being opened with explosive climaxes. Sandrine ignored it all, keeping a close eye on Odette. Despite her obvious exhaustion, there was an aura of unique coolness around her. A pitiful beauty. Sandrine knew she was facing her toughest opponent yet. She let out a sigh and set the cigarette down. She was fully aware of Bastian's desires. She understood that it was a primitive instinct, a way to satisfy his sexual needs while conveniently turning a blind eye to other matters. Their display of affection at public gatherings was no different. Sandrine held to the belief that Bastian could not be so easily swayed. There had to be something else. Sandrine struggled with that for a long while. She left the group she was hanging around with and headed toward Bastian. Bastian had mentioned that he had wanted to talk to her father before he left on his new posting. It was an important matter, she could tell that much, and her father agreed. She thought it was to discuss their marriage, since Bastian will end his 2 years fake marriage with Odette. But what if it was about something else? Just as Sandrine reached Bastian, he turned around. He did not show any sign of surprise to see her approaching. Congratulations, Bastian. Now, I guess I should be calling you Major Clauswitz. Without hesitation, Sandrine extended her hand, fully prepared for his rejection. Surprisingly, Bastian responded with kindness, taking her hand. Thank you, Countess Lennart. Was I right in thinking that you will be departing next week? Yes, he said flatly. Well, since you are not holding any sort of farewell party, I will have to bid farewell and good luck to you now. Sandrine let out a pitiful sigh. Everyone is talking about how you plan on taking your wife with you. Nothing has changed, Countess. They are false rumors, I can assure you, Bastian said, cocking an eyebrow. Sandrine's eyes sparkled with wide-eyed joy. You can't be serious, she will stay here? Yes, she will. Then what was it you wanted to talk about before going out onto the battlefield? Sandrine primed the question. Pride held significance now. If only he could soothe her anxiety, which ran through her like venom. Well, I just thought we could use the time to collaborate between Illis and Levere. Could we confirm the promise here? Is this a suitable place? Well, Bastian left room for an ambiguous response, an enigma that refused to be resolved. Good luck, Bastian. I will look forward to your eventual return, then. Sandrine placed a hand on Odette's shoulder, in an attempt at mock friendship. Hi, Odette. Let's have a good time. Sandrine couldn't help but notice how pale Odette looked. She moved past the young woman and made her way out onto the deck. The remainder of the sunset cast dark hues over the sea. The festive night glowed with bright orange light, undertoned with laughter and music that carried across the city by the wind. Bastian. Chapter 94, Not Yet. Bastian turned to look at his wife, who stood confidently by his side. She was undaunted even in the presence of the elderly generals. Odette's social skills shone brightest when challenged. To leave your wife here, alone, the Major is a soldier of extraordinary will. I wouldn't be able to do it, chuckled a silver-haired admiral. She is far too precious, I want to keep her safe. Torsay is not a good place for such a young lady, said Bastian. Pleasant laughter erupted from the other officers. Even if the rumors of you becoming soft because of your wife were true, I still would never believe it. I never thought I would ever witness the day. Once they had emptied their glasses and finished teasing the newlyweds, the generals returned. Bastian never once let go Odette's waist, his smile not once faltering. It was clear that he was experiencing the most unforgettable day in his career. Smile, Bastian whispered to Odette. Startled, Odette, who was lost in thought, snapped her head up and smiled broadly. Their eyes locked and her already flushed cheeks grew even redder. Bastian chuckled. Are you not ready to sacrifice your life for your sister? Has your conviction already wavered? Odette did not reply. Just tell me, I will be happy to respect that. Still Odette said nothing. I suggest you answer me, Odette, Bastian said somberly. Odette avoided eye contact, reluctantly lifting her face toward him. The woman was fragile, like a porcelain doll, and he feared the slightest touch could crack her. He was almost shocked to find himself wanting to see her cry, to hear her please and drop the facade. He wanted her to break down and beg to the point where he couldn't bear to hear her begging anymore. Sorry, she eventually said. A sigh escaped from Bastian's lips as Odette's eyes grew cold and emotionless. She was as calm as still water. Her determined expression and elegantly long neck only added to her majestic bearing. She was a remarkable actress. He still believed in her, even after he reminded himself why he had chosen Odette in the contracted marriage. Odette let out a laugh, mocking his foolishness. A beauty as captivating as the days that had once fed his fruitless dreams. Ultimately, every moment was a lie. Confronting the undeniable reality, the slowly drifting warship came to a halt. The time had come for the fireworks display, marking the end of the festival. Middle. Seats had been provided for Major Clauswitz and his wife on the upper deck, a gesture of consideration from the Emperor. As Odette passed through the crowd, she felt like she was walking on a cloud. She was going to reach her limit soon, with her exhausted body no longer under her control, her legs numb and her vision blurred. Despite her struggle, she made it to the railing where she took deep breaths of fresh sea air. Bastian's promise remained unwavering in her mind, leaving no room for doubt. He had always been a man of his word, even though he was mean and vulgar most of the time. Odette took a shaky breath as the crowd cheered for the first sparks of dazzling light and color that filled the sky. She did not look up as the fireworks burst one after the other. The world fell silent and darkness engulfed her. Please hang on. Despite the impending punishment, Odette clung to her final regret. Just as tears threatened to break out, Bastian scooped her up before she fell. In that moment, a number of fireworks exploded across the sky, illuminating Lausanne with gold. Ignoring the onlookers, Bastian held Odette tightly under the golden rain. He will make her pay for her betrayal. Bastian put an end to the day's agony. With Odette nearly fainting, he did his best to shelter her from the crowd around them, hiding her condition from prying eyes. He tried to soothe her by stroking the back of her head, looking at their surroundings as if weary for predators. Not yet. Only he could be the one to end her life, no one else would. Until that fateful day arrived, Odette had to remain steadfast and endure without crumbling. As the finale of the fireworks approached, Odette's panic subsided. Her body still trembled, but at least her breathing was steady. Bastian wiped away the cold sweat from her forehead with a gloved hand, ignoring the strong desire to strangle her. As the night deepened and the festival drew to a close, colorful fireworks adorned the skies and sea of Lausanne. The breathtaking spectacle of the fireworks faded to memory. Bastian looked down at her, fully aware of the nosy onlookers. Be patient, Bastian whispered with a sweet voice that belied the stern command, as if professing love. Fear instinctively gripped Odette, resistance was futile. All eyes were upon them. She was trapped, no better than a prisoner, and all she could do was brace herself against the impending agony. In that moment, they were nothing more than a mere jesters. With sudden realization, Odette's vision blurred as tears of shame welled up. Bastian, she said weakly, but the words were carried away by the air that smelled of gunpowder. Bastian lowered his eyes and calmly regarded her. In his pale blue eyes, a chilling sneer danced. Bereft of any remaining hope, Odette released her grip on him, and to her surprise, he kissed her. Middle. The Admiralty's grandest festival to date came to a triumphant close. From the resplendent Victory March, the promotions ceremony and the awe-inspiring maritime review, Bastian Clauswitz stood as the heroic figure of the Battle of Trosa. Bastian sealed his triumph with a kiss at the climax of the fireworks. The Emperor watched him, having recognized Bastian's ambition and bright prospects. His accomplishments surpassed all expectations. It was a scene of such dramatic magnitude, so masterfully executed, he was wondering if they had a scriptwriter. A self-assured smile graced the Emperor's lips. The nation's wedding would take place at the end of the year. Prince Nikolai cheered with unparalleled fervor, surpassing even the most enthusiastic onlooker. Doubts about Isabel's fidelity did not linger. Would Bastian's continue his marriage to Odette after the promised period has expired? The Emperor looked down at the impudent hero. While it would be preferable for them to stay together, ultimately he would have to honor their choice should they decide to separate. The lover's kiss, as beautiful as any painting, dissolved amidst the final embers of the fireworks. The Emperor applauded them as the rest of the crowd cheered for the fireworks. It was a grand finale that deserved applause. Bastian. Chapter 95, Origin. Bastian bid farewell to Ardennes at dawn, concluding the naval festival after a week. Gloomy expressions adorned the faces of the servants lining the front hall, a reflection of the rain that began last night and weighed heavily on the atmosphere. Bastian calmly boarded the waiting car. He did not look like a soldier bound for a rough post. Lovis, the butler, watched with some concern as Bastian's car swiftly vanished down the driveway. He held his gaze, not daring to turn away as the hostess had yet to depart also. How had they ended up in this situation? Lovis looked to Odette, hoping that she might betray some reason. When Bastian returned from Lausanne, he promptly issued the order to prepare for departure. He never commented on the changes. The wager that had consumed the mansion ended with no winner, leaving everyone shocked and disappointed. There certainly didn't seem like there was no issue between the two of them. Something the whole staff believed in, at least, but those who witnessed the couple. The same sort of sentiment prevailed among the public. Media outlets in the Empire covered the naval festival, and even highlighted the daily kisses between heroes and beauties. It bewildered everyone why the atmosphere between the couple had abruptly shifted. Bastian's stay in Ardennes lasted less than 2 days, and even then, the majority of his time was dedicated to handling urgent tasks for the company in Rats, which had to be resolved before going to Trosa Island. If one looked closely, they would be able to see signs of distance between the couple, such as no longer sharing the same bed. Even on the night before his departure, Bastian chose to sleep in his own room. Their interactions appeared more courteous than those of a couple about to part ways. In the end, many were left to speculate that Odette did not want to leave her lavish life behind for one of a military wife. As criticism of her grew louder, so too did the sympathy for Bastian, who was going off to war with a broken heart. This seemed the most plausible explanation to Lovis. "It is getting cold, madam, we should go in," Lovis said. Odette, who was still looking down the road after Bastian, turned around. "Ah, yes," a faint smile spread across her face. "Let's get back to work, shall we?" Odette swiftly made her way back into the mansion, with the servants in tow. The sound of rain pelting the windows filled the otherwise quiet hall. "Are you feeling well, ma'am?" one of the servants said, Dora, who couldn't help but notice how sickly Odette looked. "Would you like me to call a doctor?" Odette calmly shook her head. "It's fine, Dora, I'm just tired. Some rest will be enough." Odette slowly dragged herself up the stairs. She was plagued by headaches and constant chills, but it was nothing she couldn't handle. It was all done now anyway, and it wasn't until she stopped in front of her bedroom door that the reality of the situation dawned on her. Bastian was gone, and by the time he returned the contract will be finished. She was technically free. She would have thought the realization would have made her feel light, but she felt the opposite. She dragged her leaden body into the room, feeling like waterlogged wool. The sound of a heavy lock marked the start of her new life. The earnest dream that had once justified this marriage had crumbled to dust. Now all she could do was wait, and in waiting, felt the anxiety of it pressing down on her. When Bastian returned, he would no doubt bring her punishment for her crimes to bear, but in the meantime, she had to wait for it, and she couldn't just forget about it either. It plagued her mind constantly. But at least Tira was safe. That one mote of good news lifted Odette considerably, and she clung to it like a life raft in stormy seas. With every step she took, she thought, "That's a relief, that's a relief." As if chanting it brought it power to heal her. And yet, the weight of inescapable doom still cast shadows, causing her to collapse. Her legs buckled and her vision blurred. When she regained consciousness, Odette found herself sprawled out on the floor. The tension that had been building over the week finally dissipated. The bedroom was quiet, save for the mournful howls of the wind. Blankly, Odette over to the window. She did not try to lift her heavy body. Memories from her initial meeting with Bastian played out in the raindrops on the window. She could see the dingy gambling den, their departure marked by a dry kiss, the imperfection of their relationship every step of the way, but it hadn't been entirely terrible, but it was all ashes now. Odette noticed Marguerite, her loyal dog, who became more animated when their eyes met. She wagged her tail diligently and bounded over to Odette to lick her face, her mournful whimpers resembling that of a crying child. "It's okay, Meg," Odette murmured, gently cradling the puppy. Marguerite relaxed into Odette's arms as she stroked the pup. It was a moment of solace for them both. Odette felt like she could face the future with a more humble heart now. This was the outcome of her choice and it was her responsibility. If she just rolled over, everything she had strived for would be in vain? Determination filled her. This was not an acceptable end for her efforts. She wiped away her tears, straightened her pose, restoring herself to neatness. Marguerite became animated too, wagging her tail and lolling her tongue excitedly. Odette rose to her feet, Marguerite bounding around her ankles. She reminded Odette of Tara in a way. The force of the storm outside grew, shaking the trees. It promised treacherous sailing ahead. Middle. Bastian pulled up his collar, bracing himself against the storm. He made his way along the red road, covered in soggy leaves. He arrived at the docks where the transport ship waited for him. Upon seeing Bastian's approach, the junior officers and sailors halted and saluted. Bastian returned their salute and strode confidently across the docks. The carrier was crammed with additional troops from the North Sea Fleet, accompanied by family members who were mostly young wives carrying young children. A soldier shadowed Bastian and showed him to his cabin. "This one will be yours, sir," he said confidently. Bastian acknowledged the soldier with a nod, before heading in the opposite direction, heading toward the main deck. The soldier did not follow, his duty fulfilled. Just 15 minutes later, the departure alarm sounded, prompting the waiting sailors into action. Bastian casually passed them by, making for the edge of the deck. Though the gloomy, dark skies were blanketed by gray clouds, he could just about see a faint light shimmering in the distance. It was the Ferris wheel, the very thing Odette used to stare out at, lost in thought. Bastian looked out to it now, lost in his own thoughts, his face devoid of expression. The anger and fury seemed to have fled from him in that moment. In the end, he felt like the outburst was pointless. Nothing had changed. The past week had been a constant struggle to prove his point. Upon returning from Lausanne, he wasted no time in attending to the affairs of the company. He sought understanding from Thomas Muller, the one responsible for the practical matters of the company. Together they decided to abandon all current plans, and although it was significant loss, it was the best solution for now. The plan now was to retreat and regroup. Fortunately, the railway business, which was joined with Levier, was showing signs of success, averting one major crisis. If the marriage alliance with Sandrine came to fruition, it would provide a more stable platform for the foundation. And with that, everything came full circle. They were back to square one. Odette was no longer up for consideration and would be discarded as such. Bastian needed more time to plan his revenge. 5 minutes to departure. All along the deck, ropes were being tossed back to the ship and the engines spooled up, causing a deep, ambient rumble. They embarked in the pouring rain, following along the Prata River to Western Berg and finally, via the North Sea, back to the Trosa Islands. As Bastian looked back at the city, he caught a flash of Odette's face in the storm. She was smiling and bade him farewell. She appeared as beautiful as ever and as a devoted wife. Bastian did not deny the sudden vision, but it slipped away after a short while, leaving behind a flash of memory he clung to. The transport ship picked up pace and sped under the open drawbridge. Bastian roused himself and strode back along the deck, braving the wind and rain. This marked the start of a voyage that would return them to their original orbit. Middle. Bastian. Chapter 96, like a name engraved on a tombstone. Today, just like before, the postman visited the mansion at 2 o'clock. This is the exact moment when the afternoon sun illuminates the Ardennes Bay with a mesmerizing golden hue. The maid, after having retrieved the mail, made her way to the study. Odette sat at a desk by the window that overlooked the sea. It had become her haven and where she spent most of her time. Dora observed the piles of documents. "Why don't you delegate all this to Mr. Lovis?" she said reassuringly. Odette was preoccupied with the organization of the mansion's decorations and landscaping, and simply nodded to Dora. With the extensive construction projects underway over the years, there were a lot of details that needed to be checked. One could say that Odette had spent the entire summer living and breathing at the mansion. "Thank you for your concern, Dora," Odette said with a smile. Dora was aware of the meaning behind the smile and cleared her throat. "I have a letter for you, ma'am." Odette placed her pen down and looked up at Dora. The letter was stamped with the Berg postmark. It was Bastian's monthly letter, which never failed to show up in the middle of the month. Odette carefully put on the practiced expression of excitement befitting a devoted wife. She handled the letter delicately. With her task done, Dora backed away, gave a polite bow, then left the room. Letting her smile drop, Odette stared at the letter like it was a giant, slimy slug. She calmly opened the letter, unfolding the crisp, white paper. She found a check nestled inside. This had become a familiar sight. Just simple check with no further instructions. From the moment Bastian had embarked, he had sent her monthly checks. It wasn't until the third month that Odette realized the meaning behind them. Payments disguised as love letters. She felt like she had no other choice than to accept the money and pretend to swoon at the imagined words inside if anyone was around when she opened the letters. Even after being betrayed, Bastian didn't cut her salary. Determined not to linger on the sense of shame she felt, Odette stuffed the letter into the desk drawer and moved on. The amount of money she had accumulated since signing the contract with Bastian was becoming substantial. It was reasonable to believe that her target had been achieved. An idea suddenly struck Odette. Would it be wise to send Tyr to the New World as well? A place far beyond the reach of even Bastian. She needed to make the decision before he returned. Taking a sip of tea, Odette looked out to the sunset. With all her hard work, the mansion should be complete in time for Bastian's return. Although she did not need to oversee the work herself, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction doing so, like she had given herself purpose. Finishing up her tea, Odette turned her attention to devising a reply to Bastian's letter. It was important to maintain the appearance of a loving couple, and Bastian looked as if he was not yet ready to publicly announce their divorce yet. It was the best she could hope for after a long struggle. In a moment of respite, a drop of ink fell onto the blank page. Letting out a sigh, she wiped it away with a bit of cloth, but it had already left its mark. Odette calmly accepted the situation, approaching the fireplace with a folded letter. As she watched it turn to ashes and disappear, she returned to her desk. After making sure there was no trace left, she filled a fresh pen with ink and began writing anew. She decided that was enough. Middle. The residence for the officers of the North Fleet was situated in the heart of the main island, in a peaceful residential area that one could reach after crossing through the city park. A military car carrying Major Clauswitz pulled to a stop at the entrance. The driver quickly got out and opened the passenger door. Despite being out to sea for a considerable amount of time, the Major had minimal luggage. "Oh, sir, let me," the driver said, reaching for Bastian's bags. "No, just go back to your duties," Bastian said, passing by the driver with a brief salute. He never once looked at the boy. A cold, misty rain fell from the low clouds. August was only just coming to an end, but it felt like the island was already in the midst of autumn. "Hello, Major." A lively voice called out to him. Bastian looked up from where the voice came from. A young lady stood in front of the officer's residence. It was the wife of Lieutenant Kalon, who lived next door. "Have you finished your duties for the day? You must have had a hard time on the rough seas," the young woman continued. "I suppose, I just got on with it. Thank you for your concern, ma'am." Bastian gave as polite a response as he could muster, with a ceremonial smile. Frustrated, Mrs. Kalon adjusted her umbrella with an awkward smile. "You'll be tired, I bet. Go and get some rest. I would love to arrange for a little party for you, if you don't mind," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Kalon, but you don't need to put yourself out like that." "What do you mean? I can't just let the benefactor of my family go like this. It would be a great honor if you could allow me this small chance to show my gratitude." Mrs. Kalon was a very stubborn woman that never backed down. Lieutenant Kalon was a newly commissioned officer, and as such, his family had been appointed a single accommodation, barely big enough for them all. While Bastian had been appointed a rather large and lavish accommodation that would suit Lieutenant Kalon and his family, so Bastian made the rash decision to swap. His kindness earned him a reputation for exceptional character, which greatly benefits him. Bastian bid Mrs. Kalon farewell and made his way to his accommodation situated at the end of the row of houses. As soon as he stepped through the front door, he could smell the food prepared by the housekeeper. After removed his raincoat and officer hat, Bastian went straight to his bedroom to unpack his trunk and following a refreshing shower before heading back downstairs for dinner. The sun had set by the time he felt full and poured himself a brandy in the drawing room. On the desk were neat piles of mail he needed to sort through. He sat on the small sofa to filter through them, and the topmost letter was from Odette. He carefully opened it and stared at the contents. A neat little ink blot signed Odette Derisi and Marie-Laure Charlotte Clauswitz. Bastian laughed. The woman that had worked so hard to maintain the appearance of someone who was noble and elegant, to garner a reputation of someone who loved her husband, who was nothing more than a cheap snob that had sold her life for money, sold her faith and everything else for pride, was now nothing more than a cheap joke. She was destined to be someone to be forgotten, much like a name engraved on a tombstone. Setting the letter aside, Bastian leaned against the armrest of the sofa and swiftly moved on to the remaining letters. Among them was a letter from Sandrine. "My beloved Bastian," it read. Sandrine's letter was a language of passion, brimming with love and admiration. She was a fiery woman and was only growing bolder when she finalized her divorce. She was headstrong and an ideal match for Bastian, an opportunity he would be a fool to pass up. Setting down his now empty glass, he rose from the sofa, brushed back his tangled hair and stood by the rain-streaked window. Water droplets from his wet hair fell onto his nose and vanished behind his open bathrobe. He leisurely smoked his cigar as he looked out into the damp darkness, thinking about Odette. Without the need to issue paychecks this month, as he was returning to the Ardennes, his only remaining task was to finish off that contract so that he could slot everything back into its desired place. With another puff, Bastian turned and made his way towards his bed, his footsteps blending into the soft echoes of the serene North Sea night. Middle. Bastian. Chapter 97, New Round. Even if she gets married and has children, she will still be as stubborn as ever. It seems like I will be laid out in the coffin before Isabelle becomes obedient. Countess Trier said sharply, projecting her voice over the din of the rattling carriage. It's all right, Countess. A faint smile appeared on Odette's face. The Countess collapsed her fan and clucked her tongue. Isabelle, accompanied by her husband and son, paid a visit to Berg, where she received a grand reception, marking it as her first stately visit as Princess Belov, quickly followed by an evening ball. It seems so, somehow, the Countess said, examining Odette with some concern. Odette had received an invitation to the ball and replied that she would not be attending due to health reasons, but Isabelle's stubbornness refused to take no for an answer, and so Odette found herself in a carriage bound for the palace. Isabelle's insistence had a reason: she wanted to liquidate their past in front of everyone. It seemed like the Empress had yielded to her daughter's demands. You should have followed your husband. It's plain to see that Isabelle is just taking advantage of his absence to mistreat you. Even though the Countess was clearly upset and infuriated by the situation, Odette couldn't help but laugh. I don't see why you and Bastian had to separate like this, when your affection for one another is so clear. How can love letters be enough? Bastian just wanted me to live in peace, Odette said, wiping cold sweat from her brow with a handkerchief. Just look at yourself, dear. How can you call this living in peace? It was just a little cold. Nonsense. The fever is rising so high that your doctor could have fired an egg on you, yet you still deny it. How many times must this happen before you take it seriously? It was true that Odette's health had been rapidly deteriorating since the start of summer, but she was never really in good health to begin with. The Countess worried about what lay ahead for Odette. Even if she is the Empress' daughter, it's no excuse to be parading around a sickly child for her own amusement. The Empress has been quite considerate. Once Isabelle is done, I will return home. Ah, really? The Countess frowned at Odette, unable to understand how Odette could be so nonchalant. Odette sighed as she looked out the window. The carriage was moving through the turning intersections adorned with marble fountains. High atop the magnificent buildings in the distance, a shimmering trident, which symbolized the god of the sea, caught her attention. She fixated upon the naval castle, its gray hues glowing in the setting sun. Young officers would be making their way home right now, eager to be in the warmth of their homes and their partners' arms. Odette saw a young woman sat by the fountain. She rose quickly, adjusting her attire and flushing a pink color that was not from the sun's late rays. I bet you can't wait to see him again, the Countess said. Do you yearn for your heartless husband, even though he hasn't taken any time for you in the last 2 years? It's not like that, Odette said, shaking her head. She watched as the woman hugged a young man in the dark blue of the Navy uniform. It's just been hard for him to find the time. He had a lot of duties that takes him away a lot of the time. He will take a vacation when he is able. Do you really think that everything will come crashing down because one officer decided to take a little break to be with his wife? His career has consumed him and unfortunately, you have been pushed aside, the Countess snorted. If your husband truly had a mind to, he would come to see you, no matter what. I have no doubt about that. You're smart. I couldn't meet him because things weren't going well. Bastian was always so kind and devoted, taking care of my father and my sister. You really don't like it when people insult your husband, do you, even when it's the truth?" The Countess flashed a mischievous smile. Despite the misunderstanding, Odette chose not to argue and resolved to being the committed wife, while also worrying about the consequences of a divorce would have. She realized it was beyond her control. As the palace drove into view, Odette took out a small vial from her bag, the medicine Dr. Kramer has prescribed. With the Countess unraveling her shawl, Odette downed the contents in one gulp. Odette, the hero's wife, and the imperial lady both took a deep breath, contemplating the night's mission. The imperial palace, visible through the window, was adorned with brilliant lights that seemed to illuminate the very sky. Odette stepped forth from the carriage with a confidence and a smile, embracing the lights that pushed back the evening's gloom. Middle. The military port on Trosa Island, located at its southern shores, was home to the North Sea Fleet. With its spacious facilities and dull gray colors, it was normally a somber place, but today was different. "We will be there in about 15 minutes, Major." A nervous voice caught Bastian's attention. He turned his attention from the window to the driver, who visibly swallowed. Bastian gave a nod, but didn't say anything, refocusing on the paper he had been reading, before the world outside distracted him. It was Thomas Mueller's report, which was unusually thick. Bastian took his time to go over the details. He's ready to start a new round. It was clear on one thing: if the last war was nothing more than a disturbance, this time was verging on an all-out war. Something Bastian favored more, as the lines of engagement were a lot clearer to follow. Once the report was done, Bastian moved on to the next document, which was about Odette and her recent activities. He examined this one closely. It was a glimpse into the competence of the constabulary. Well organized and meticulous in its details about the status of Odette's father and sister. As always, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Other than being his wife, Odette's life was rather plain and unexciting. She went about her duties as she should and nothing much more. She spent most of her time within the walls of the Ardennes mansion, keeping a very small social circle, with little interaction between Theodora and her son Franz. On the last page of the thin report, there was a picture of Odette and Franz attending a special exhibition at the museum, an opening ceremony from the previous month. Odette was admiring the paintings, while Franz was admiring her. Nothing problematic, but no doubt scandal would arise from it. An affair with her husband's half-brother. If only that was reason enough to get divorced, and if only Theodora's desperate engagement with Count Klein could be destroyed. While sorting through the reports, they pulled up to a checkpoint, beyond which the port teemed with activity. Once identities were confirmed, the driver swiftly navigated toward the dock. There the transport ship waited. Glancing at his wristwatch, Bastian gracefully stepped out of the car. The calm North Sea, devoid of wind and waves, shimmered in a chilling shade of blue. There was a good half hour until departure. Middle. Bastian. Chapter 98, Right Action. Finally, Isabelle and Odette met. The reunion of the two cousins who had been involved with the same man was a much-anticipated event. Sandrine, having finished exchanging formal greetings, approached the group where the conversation was taking place. "I was quite immature back then," Isabelle was saying, a subtle smile on her face. "Well, you have certainly matured in your marriage, that and motherhood seems to have tempered you quite well," whispered the young Countess Escher, covering her mouth with a fan. Sandrine smiled in agreement. It was much better than the childlike behavior that once turned the royal family upside down due to her infatuations. "Yes, I can't believe what a stupid mistake I had made. It was so uncomfortable to leave without being afforded the opportunity to apologize." Isabelle took Odette's hand, playing to the crowd that had gathered around them. "Although it might be too late, I still wish to express my sincerest apologies, Odette. Truly I am sorry. Can you find it in your heart to forgive me?" "I have already forgotten about it, Your Highness. It's all right, so please, don't concern yourself with it any longer," said Odette calmly. Isabelle's goal was clear: to erase her shameful past and establish herself as a prestigious crown princess. Odette knew her role was to support her in this objective. "Thank you for your understanding, Odette. I hope that we can be friends now." Isabelle extended her hand, capturing the attention of everyone, including the crown prince, Belov. What was once a reluctant marriage, blossomed into true love between the two. With the birth of their child, the alliance between Berg and Belov grew stronger, fulfilling the details of their arrangement. As if embracing this new chapter in her life, Odette bowed her head and kissed the back of Isabel's hand, a symbol of her fealty and unwavering friendship. Isabel, unable to conceal her nervousness, finally beamed a radiant smile. With a pampered look, Isabel turned to her husband. "When Major Clauswitz returns home, I want to invite the two of you as guests of the Belov family, may I?" The Crown Prince Belov agreed readily. "Of course, feel free to do as you like. I love you, Nikolai, marrying you is the best blessing of my life." Isabel concluded the play with an emotional confession and a passionate kiss. Her love for the prince appeared as passionate as ever. Odette had done her job, played her role and left quietly. It was just as she was able to escape beyond the gathered crowd that she saw Sandrine's face amongst them. "Great job, Odette," she said, as she approached with joy. "It must have been pretty hard for you to go through that, but you held together quite well. I won't forget your contributions to Bastian in the end. Money is best for you, right?" With the end fast approaching, Sandrine was determined to remind Odette of her place in the grand scheme of things, and in the end, Bastian would be hers. "Have a pleasant evening, Lady Levere," Odette said simply, trying not to rise to Sandrine's bait, and made her way to the balcony to get some fresh air. She stood there for a long while, with her eyes closed and her mind shut away from the world. She didn't realize that she was no longer alone on the balcony until she opened her eyes again and turned to leave, only to come face to face with Franz Clauswitz. He looked anxious, as he nervously adjusted his bow tie. Unable to contain his patience any longer, he gathered all the courage he could. "Have you thought about my offer?" The first dance was about to start, and with his engagement to Ella von Klein, he didn't have much time to spare. "If you're talking about the art exhibition, I know I've already given you an answer to that," Odette said, staring out to the darkness beyond him. "Odette, please," Franz said, calling her name like a plea. With Bastian's return scheduled to the end of the year, the ongoing conflict between the two would reignite, with Odette's fate caught in the middle of it. "I would ask that you consider it seriously." "No matter how much I think about it, my answer remains unchanged," Odette said firmly. When they had met on a mezzanine overlooking the art exhibit, Franz had offered to whisk Odette away to some foreign land before Bastian returned. He declared that he would do everything in his power to make Odette happy, if she promised to be his woman. Do not be misled, Bastian's forgiveness was never granted. He simply postponed his retaliation, waiting until he could satisfy all his greedy desires. Franz brushed his face repeatedly, removing his glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose. He displayed this nervousness on the day that he proposed to Odette, and more recently in art exhibit when he tried to kiss her. Odette braced herself. "Even so, it has nothing to do with you," Odette said, shaking her head and backing away a step. Franz's laugh gave her goosebumps. "Don't say that, I'm the only one for you now." "Get away from me," Odette near shouted. "But I love you, Odette, do you still not understand?" Franz blocked Odette's retreat path, but the door out of the balcony burst open and Countess Trier was revealed. "Don't look so surprised, dear," the Countess said, brushing past Franz to stand next to Odette. Flustered, Franz made a hasty exit. Odette let out a sigh of relief. The Countess did not seem to notice. "I got an urgent call from Ardennes informing me that the hospital is urgently seeking you. You are needed this very instant." The hospital?" Odette said, nervously. "Yes, Duke Diessen, your father, is in critical condition," the Countess said. Her voice was as flat as if she was conveying the "we other." "Oh, I see," was all Odette said. It was just another round of misfortune to pile on top of everything else. The moon faded beneath the embrace of deepening clouds, as the weather whispered of an impending rainstorm. Middle. At the end of the bench in the hospital room, Tara crouched in tears. The dimly lit surroundings and the shadowy movements of the trees in the wind and rain heightened the somber atmosphere. Odette wearily made her way to Tara. The two sisters of Diessen stood as the only witnesses to the unfolding scene. "Calm down, Tara." Odette's heavily fatigued voice broke the eerie silence. Only then did Tara raise her head to look at her sister. She bit her lip. "That doctors are saying we should prepare for the worst," Tara said. "Maybe we should," Odette replied calmly. "Last spring, their father's health took a sudden turn for the worse due to complications from years of being bedridden. The doctors also emphasized the patient's own will to live was a primary concern." Odette shared that concern. "He came to his senses not too long ago. This may be our last chance to talk to him." "I don't think father wants to see me," Tara thundered. How long are you going to be so cowardly? Sister, at least keep our father's deathbed, Odette said in a more stern manner. Tira had completed her schooling and was planning on moving out to Karlsbar instead of returning to the capital. She planned on finding a boarding house, securing a job and starting her life out there. Although this was contrary to Odette's plans, she could do nothing but accept her sister's wishes. She was an adult now and could do as she wished. It was up to her to take responsibility for her life and make her own mistakes. If you feel comfortable turning away from our father, you may do so, I won't stop you, but you will have to live with that guilt for the rest of your life. Take the chance to atone, before it's too late. If not for you, then do it for father. I know, I would love to, but I can't, not now, I just can't. Tira stepped back, shedding hot tears. Her trembling hands wrapped around her stomach. Why? Odette said forcefully. Because, if I get father riled up, it could be dangerous. Again, Tira, just explain so I can understand. I mean. Tira chewed her lip, considering the right words to say. I'm sorry sister, but I have a baby. The hallway fell into a deep silence and the only sound was that of the distant rain pelting windows and the roof. Just as Odette was about to say something, the bell to their father's room rang out. Overwhelmed and unsure of what to do, Tira slumped onto the bench, wrapping her arms around her legs and pulling herself into a tight ball, let her tears and sadness flow freely. Odette watched her, her own eyes becoming blurred by water. A younger sister who was pregnant outside of marriage and her father on his deathbed. The sheer weight of everything was unimaginable. It felt more plausible to believe that it was all just a terrible nightmare. Mrs. Clauswitz? The nurse cried out from her father's room. Odette had to confront the unavoidable reality. She hid her sadness as best she could as she confronted the nurse. Tira, go to Countess Trier's house, Odette said sternly. Tira's cries grew more intense, but there was not time to argue. Without looking back, Odette raced into the hospital room. Her father took precedence and there was no room for hesitation. This was the right action. Bastian. Chapter 99, Rain Like Fog. Is this it? A funeral out in the countryside? Once she had given her condolences, Marchioness Demel turned and sighed deeply. Her husband, Admiral Demel, looked about the small chapel with mixed feelings. It was hard to believe that this was all there was for such a great man, the husband of an imperious woman and descendant of a well-respected family. Someone who had achieved the very pinnacle of imperial aristocracy. How terribly unkind of His Majesty, regardless of his hatred toward Duke Diessen. I wonder how the Clauswitz couple might be feeling at such a funeral. Marchioness Demel dabbed away tears with the corner of her handkerchief. Odette looked resolved. The Women's Association of the Navy had offered their support, but she had declined, not wishing to be a burden. If she had accepted, her father's funeral could have been more fitting for such a man. Perhaps it's for the best. The fewer people who see, the less chance for gossip. Yes, I can understand the desire to keep it small, given Duke Diessen's reputation. Marchioness Demel looked about the mourners in the small chapel with a mix of compassion and curiosity. Odette was stood at the coffin of her father. She was well composed for someone who had just lost a father. It would be hard for anyone to have guessed that she was in mourning. It must be hard to maintain such a facade. Oh, which reminds me. Do you know when Major Clauswitz's ship is due to come in? If the sailing is smooth, his ship should arrive tonight, although the exact time can never be certain. We will just have to wait and see. Such a shame that he could not have gotten here in time to attend the funeral. It must be so hard to have to go through this alone. With a resigned sigh, Marchioness Demel took her seat. It's so strange to think of those two together. Something doesn't add up. There has to be a story there, she said confidently. Odette was completely unaware that her husband was due to return that evening. The Marchioness learned this when she was able to talk to Odette alone briefly. She had asked Odette if it was not better for her to wait until Bastian's return to hold the funeral. Odette simply shook her head. The long journey made it impossible and he would not return in good enough time. Which meant she didn't know that Bastian had set sail the previous weekend, before Duke Diessen's passing. I know that it's hard to establish contact with a warship when it's sailing, Marchioness Demel said to her husband. But I find it hard to believe that Odette doesn't know her husband is on his way home, so why can't she wait another day? As she pondered this rhetoric, her brows furrowed. Admiral Demel simply grunted. But if she truly doesn't know her husband is returning, then why would Major Clauswitz conceal this from his wife? I don't. It was a deliberate plot. He might have simply not had time. His recall was rather swift. I doubt that he had such a tight schedule that he couldn't take 5 minutes to send a letter, especially not for a man so dedicated to his wife, or did he just simply forget to share such important news? Admiral Demel opened his mouth to say something, but he was at a loss for words. He closed his mouth and swallowed the lump in his throat. He wanted to defend Major Clauswitz's honor, but he could no longer think of any logically reasoning that would adequately defend him. I thought it was suspicious when he hadn't taken a single day off in the last 2 years. I don't suppose you've heard anything, any rumors? What kind of rumors? Anything, like, does he have a woman on the side? Sure dear. Major Clauswitz is a true and honorable person, a hero of the Navy. I know, but he's also a burly man in his prime. Any woman would die for just one night with him. That's. The chapel doors swung open, saving Admiral Demel from a very awkward conversation. Everyone in the chapel all turned their attention to the entrance at the same time. Even his wife stopped her rumor-mongering to look. To everyone's surprise, the unexpected mourner turned out to be Count Sanders, along with his young daughter. Duke Diessen lay peacefully in the coffin surrounded by lilies. He looked no different to someone lost to slumber. Coming face to face with the reality that her father was now dead, Odette still found it hard to cry. It wasn't loss that she was feeling, but a heavy weight of guilt and remorse, mixed with a strange sense of relief. He passed when the rain had finally ceased, during the 3rd day of his voyage, sometime late into the afternoon. Odette had been sitting at his bedside, diligently keeping watch. Although the agonizing fits had subsided, he had never been lucid enough for her to say a proper farewell. Even without the excessive amounts of painkillers keeping him from being lucid, any time that he opened his eyes, he would simply ramble to himself. He would mutter about his time as a carefree boy at an esteemed private school, or the admired socialite, the clandestine lover of an imperial lady. He seemed happy lost in those bittersweet memories, and Odette did not want to spoil it for him. At the least, her father's last moments were happy ones, rather than him blaming and cursing his own daughter. Helene. The name whispered from his weak lips, carried on his increasingly shallow breath, and then, after but a moment, he had no more breath with which to speak. The only time Odette cried was when she was calling for the doctor. Odette lifted her head, suppressing her sympathy and disappointment for foolish lovers. She looked around at the mournful faces, spotting Tira sat at the far end of the chapel, tears flowing down her cheeks. It was time to think about Tara. Mrs. Clauswitz, a child's voice called out, and while Odette gathered herself, a child ran down the chapel and hugged Odette's leg. Alma. Are you okay? Alma said, looking up at Odette, tears wetting her face. I'm fine, Alma. No, you're heartbroken. Did your father tell you? Yes, he said we are coming here to give you lots of hugs because you are heartbroken. Odette noticed that Alma was wearing a floral ribbon in her head, the very one that Odette had made her for her birthday last year. Odette giggled weakly, because although the child was trying to console her, she was more bubbly than what should be allowed. Alma, Count Sanders said, looking embarrassed for his child's boisterous behavior. I'm sorry, she doesn't quite understand. That's all right, it was actually very effective, Odette said with a slim smile. It doesn't hurt anymore? Alma said, a glint in her eye. No, it doesn't, thank you Alma, Odette said. Alma beamed up at Odette, and the bleak atmosphere of the small chapel was forgotten for a moment. Odette went to a knee and kissed Alma on the cheek as Count Sanders watched them. Their eyes met and a tender smile curled his lips. Alma had the same dark chocolate eyes as him. Daddy, Alma said gleefully and jumped into her father's arms. With a quiet sigh, Count Sanders reprimanded his daughter for acting too boisterous in the current setting. Even when being admonished, Alma still sported the same bright smile. Did me and my father ever have that kind of time together? A fleeting thought passed through Odette's mind. Odette adjusted her veil back over her face and greeted the next new mourner that had come up to pay their respects, Countess Trier, as a representative of the imperial family. A black car pulled up outside the main gates of the chapel grounds. Beyond the gate, the graveyard spread out across the green grass outside the front of the chapel. The place looked abandoned and crumbling. Annoyed, Hans unfolded a map, double-checking his location. This was undoubtedly the funeral hall, and his confusion only grew. He had never taken a wrong turn. Good job. A low voice from the backseat said. Hans spun around to look at his passenger, who was peering at the chapel through the window. Hans sprang out of his seat and moved around to open the passenger door for Bastian to step out. Despite the weariness of such a long and rapid journey, Bastian looked pristine and fresh. Bastian's unexpected arrival this morning caught Hans off guard, and in his state of shock, took a staff car out to the middle of nowhere, half driving and half checking directions on the map. "You don't need to wait around for me," Bastian said, stepping toward the chapel. "If you're sure, my lord. It is an order." Hans saw no need to be stubborn in the face of an order from a superior. He had been Bastian's confidant for over a decade now, he understood his master's temperament. Hans took his place in the driver's seat and did not waste a second. As the engine came to roar, he looked up at the dark clouds overhead. The rain was going to come down so thick it resembled fog. An adequate atmosphere for such a bleak funeral. Bastian. Chapter 100, My husband is back. According to the notice on the door of the chapel, the funeral was set to start at noon. Unhurriedly, Bastian pulled a packet of cigarettes from his pocket and looked at his wristwatch. 15 minutes until the scheduled time. The crows descended from the lofty sky, their wings gliding down to embrace the desolate cemetery. Bastian looked up at the cathedral. Despite its crumbling appearance, it still held a certain elegant charm. Its grand past, coupled with its humble present, only served to deepen the feeling of despair it gave off. It was certainly a fitting position to oversee the passing of a beggar. The place looked absolutely deserted, and Bastian wondered if Odette had done this on purpose to save spending a penny of his fortune. He flipped up the collar of his raincoat. The air was getting thick with dampness and it was going to rain at any second. He exhaled a thick stream of smoke, his eyes fixed on the chapel. Word of Duke Diessen's passing reached him almost as soon as he stepped foot on the docks. He was handed the obituary via telegram and he decided to grab the fastest staff car and make his way here. The telegram had come from Admiral Demel and clearly a directive from the Emperor. Odette's father passed away. It took a while for Bastian to properly comprehend the news, and on the journey up, he found he had to laugh. Duke Diessen had shown unwavering consistency right until the last. Bastian exhaled another puff of his cigarette, his cynicism fueled by the weed-covered cemeteries in the backdrop. Despite his passing having uprooted his plans, the inconvenience of it was negligible. The passage of events will ultimately remain unchanged. Bastian would just need to take a minor detour. Still, the thought of having to wade through unsavory events again remained a burden. The Emperor had bestowed upon his hero a reward of marriage with very little justification, but in the reality of it was mundane and inconsequential. Nothing had changed really. The fate of this bargain was sealed when the Emperor arranged their union, a repayment of a debt owed by the woman's father. Where was the honor in having a wife of high-born lineage? Bastian rhythmically puffed on his cigarette and approached the chapel doors again. Memories of Lady Odette, who was only tolerated in higher circles because of her borrowed clothes, surfaced briefly before the dilapidated ruins. Had she hailed from a real imperial family, Duke Diessen wouldn't be sent away in such an undignified manner. The royal family no longer needed her. Faced with that evidence, Bastian found himself rather relaxed. Seeing the Emperor urging him to act as her husband at the funeral, he seemed to regret leaving his niece in such a mess. It would make divorce much easier for him, so there's no reason why he can't be the Emperor's dog once more at this time. He stepped into the role with full awareness. It was a strategic move in dealing with the Emperor, and its rewards were soon to materialize. It would also allow him the opportunity to question his recent doubts in his overseas service. Bastian tossed away the cigarette butt and replaced his cap on his head. His cold, thick and dark eyes mirrored the gray clouds pregnant with rain. Letting out a smoky sigh, he made his way to the chapel entrance. Noontime had arrived. The time had come for him to adopt the role of grieving and supporting husband to a beggar princess. Middle. When the noon bell rang, the funeral ceremony began. Alma had been dozing off and was suddenly disturbed from her sleep by the sound. Odette shifted and adjusted so that she could provide a more comfortable support for the sleepy child. Satisfied, Alma murmured as she fell back asleep. Maximin sat behind them and watched. Alma was secure in Odette's arms and showed no signs of ever falling off the bench. The child was quite fond of Odette, despite their not being related and the families not being that close. "Come here, Alma, sit with Daddy," the Count said, making his way around the bench so that he could take Alma, but when Alma stirred and realized what was going on, burrowed herself deeper into Odette's arms. "It's okay," said Odette. "I'll hand her over to you when she fall asleep." Her whisper blended harmoniously with the organ's melodious tune. "Okay, I guess I'll trouble you in a bit," he said, taking a seat next to Odette. It was considered a faux pas, but it was better than having to disturb the ceremony with a screaming child. "I shouldn't have brought her, please accept my apology, I wasn't thinking." Odette gave Maximin a little smile. "No, I'm glad I have Alma. I'm also grateful for your consideration." It didn't seem right that Maximin was sitting next to Odette when Tira was condemned to the back benches just because she was an illegitimate child. Odette tried to convince the church to let Tira sit with her, but they refused to break with custom. Tira was humble in accepting the reality of the situation. She seemed a little relieved not to associate herself with Duke Diessen. That left Odette to sit at the front of the ceremony alone, guarding the empty seats as the lone heir. If it had not been for Alma, who was practically Odette's shadow at this point, it might have been a much colder ordeal. "It seems the stubborn young lady has finally fallen asleep, I'll take her back now," Maximin said. Odette very carefully shifted the small bundle of Alma into her father's arms. She murmured a little, but did not wake from her sleep. It was at that moment that the doors of the chapel opened and a tall man in a naval uniform stood at the threshold. Middle. The pipe organ stopped its sonorous stroll and the whole chapel looked to see Bastian making his way down the aisle. He strode as if he didn't have a care in the world, taking in the shabby chapel interior, which was a little more well-kept than he would have thought, given the state of the exterior, and stopped at the coffin to pay his respects. He could smell the abundance of lilies before he saw them flooded in the coffin with the deceased Duke. Duke Diessen lay peacefully in the center, his figure looking better than Bastian had seen in ages. What pleased Bastian most was the absence of his boisterous voice that had once tormented him, was now silenced for eternity. "I'm Bastian Clauswitz, I'm sorry for my tardiness," Bastian excused himself to the priest, who just looked at him. "You are Lady Odette's husband? We are just glad that you could make it," the priest said with a benevolent smile, giving him the lily for the offering. The mournful organ continued its hymnal as Bastian placed the flower before Duke Diessen's portrait. Odette felt the scene was like a surreal dream until he turned his gaze to her seat. Bastian turned his attention towards the family seat and their eyes met briefly in the soft, flickering candlelight. Odette held her breath and her hands together. Bastian's face looked sharper and tougher, reflecting the last 2 years of his journey with mature features. His fierce sun-kissed skin and serene eyes serve as a testament to the obvious change. "My husband is back? But how?" Odette said to herself. It took a while for Odette to work up the courage to look at her husband's face. She remained transfixed on the gold buttons, engraved with the naval insignia upon their domed surface. When there was no other way to deny the fact that Bastian was really here, she looked up into his face. She had been transfixed on this moment for a long time, wondering what it would be like to see Bastian again after so long. She had made numerous assumptions about what he would do or say to her, but the result was always the same: hatred and contempt. She humbly prepared herself to accept it, but the confusion caused by him was like the calm surface of a lake, getting deeper and deeper. Odette stared into his clear blue eyes, which could not discern any emotions. She rose from her seat and turned to face him. Without saying a single thing, Bastian only giving her a silent salute, Odette reciprocated with a curtsy. It was hard to identify any signs of surprise or embarrassment in either of them. Bastian looked past Odette to the man that had the audacity to sit in his seat and recalled the name of a botanist that was raising his child on his own, Maximin van Zanders. He was still holding a sleeping girl in his arms. He recalled that he was one of Odette's new friends named in the detective's reports he had read. The friendship must be greater than he had initially guessed, for him to so brazenly break common courtesy. Bastian returned his cynical eye to Odette. She was a very wicked woman, already looking for the next man to leech off of. His snide thoughts slipped from his mind as Odette lifted her mourning veil, slowly revealing a slender neck, plump, sorrowful lips and the cutest little nose. The fire burning in his mind quenched. Odette rested the veil over her hat and she looked up at the cross hanging in front of the stained-glass window, above where her father lay. Bastian was willing to face those mournful, turquoise eyes. It was a reunion that was more than expected.